So in the last talk, we introduced this case study of Eleanor Roosevelt, this remarkable introverted woman who became, as Martin Luther King said, perhaps the most outstanding woman of their time, and made incredible creative contributions. Today we're going to we looked at the sort of beginning of her life and where she was going, and today we'll really look at how she became a great creative problem solver. So Eleanor Roosevelt, as we left her off in the last talk, she had become First Lady of the United States, had been First Lady of New York for 4 years while her husband was governor, and then became First Lady of the United States. And because she cared, she had values, and she cared about some issues, social issues, she began to think, how could I leverage this position I'm in to pursue some things that I care about? And she made incredible contributions in 4 areas. She created a kind of political commentary that no other First Lady had ever done. And in fact, very few other people had ever done in the United States. She became a commenter on politics. And then she became a huge advocate for civil rights, as we mentioned, as we stood by the MLK statue. She became a huge advocate for women's rights, and in a broader sense, in the latter part of her life, she became a big advocate for human rights through the United Nations. So how did she get there? So in 1935, she would have become First Lady in 32. It took her a while to get her feet on the ground. How can I use this position as a platform? And she began in political commentary in a column that she called My Day. She was invited by one of the syndicated newspaper companies to put this in newspapers all over the country. And she wrote 500 words a day, 6 days a week, from 1935 until the end of her life. And she wrote this commentary. Now, she was very serious about her column. She really had a lot of respect for journalists, and she was willing to put in time very regularly, meet her deadlines, and this was a big deal for her. Now, she mostly talked about, or significantly, she talked about fluffy things. People expected. The First Lady of the United States is supposed to go to lots of parties. She's supposed to have big state dinners. She's supposed to meet lots of important people. And Eleanor Roosevelt did not disappoint her readers on that account. She would talk about, yes, we brought out the Lincoln china, and it's so lovely, it's got little blue flowers on it, and on my right was the commissioner of blah, 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 blah. But then she would ease into what that discussion was about and what the political issue was that meeting was grappling with. And she had a lot of issues she was interested in. I mentioned that she'd started this company in Appalachia to make furniture. She's very interested in rural arts, these poor people that had been put out of work by industrialization. And it's in the Depression, and they're poor. And she's interested in rural arts. She's interested in housing of all sorts. And this was a huge problem in the 1930s. I can remember in my family, I had a great aunt and uncle who he had a job, which was good in the Depression. Not everybody did, but they couldn't find any housing. And then they ended up living in what had been a chicken coop that they renovated into the place they lived and raised their 2 sons. Housing was a crisis, and she wanted to talk about that. She was very interested in country life. She felt like people in cities, people are always talking about their problems and what they're doing. She was interested in those poor people out in the country that are kind of forgotten. Her husband had started this WPA, Work Project Administration, where they're putting people back to work by building civic buildings. She wanted those to be libraries, and she was interested in promoting that. She was interested in public health. She was very interested in community centers, especially for African Americans. She had worked in these community centers for immigrants in New York City, so Polish people, Italian people, Irish people, they were learning education, language, skills, crafts, getting social interaction at these community centers. But she said, wait, there are these people in the South who were slaves, and we never made any community centers for them. It's time to make those kind of places for everyone in the country. She was interested in flood control. That, again, was a rural problem significantly. She wanted an 8-hour day for nurses. Boy, she really paraded that one over and over in her column. She was interested in safety campaigns that really led to OSHA, but like on construction jobs, people were being killed because they didn't have regulations that required them to be safe. And she wanted those regulations. She was very interested in black and white cooperation, this breaking down racial boundaries. And just in general, she's a big advocate for education. So she's writing this column 6 days a week, and she's got a forum for talking about all these causes that she believes in. But they're all kind of sugar-coated with this account of, who's at the table and what the conversation is, and making it kind of social. And that delighted her audience. And it was much more effective than if she'd just been preaching to them like a social worker. Her top priority, both in her writing and in her politics, was including people who'd been left out. And this is, as we saw from her childhood, she was a little bit of an outsider. She didn't fit in perfectly. And she felt like there were, millions of Americans who had been left out of the American dream, and particularly African Americans, women, children, who had grown up as outsiders. And she wanted them to be treated well. She was sensitive to the injustice of leaving out so many Americans. So in terms of civil rights, this was a top priority. She boldly compared racism in America to anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany. She was taking these fascists like Hitler and Mussolini and saying, look how they treat segments of their population. Wait, aren't we doing the same thing to African Americans in this country? And whoa, that provoked a controversy and an outcry, but she didn't shy away from it. She wasn't afraid of being a little controversial in these articles. In 1945, she joined the board of the NAACP. This was a big step. This was a pretty radical group, the NAACP at its inception, and it was all African Americans that were on their board and involved in it. And she became the token white lady in the room. And she begins to confer with them and consult with them on how they can advance their cause. In that context, she got introduced to Thurgood Marshall, who was their NAACP counsel. She got a lot of admiration for him. Later on, she got her husband to appoint him to the Supreme Court. She felt that civil rights in the North and in the South depended on integrated housing. We can't have everybody separated into these segmented communities. We need to have them getting to know each other and respecting each other. It was really her work in the 1930s that laid the groundwork for the kind of civil rights legislation that LBJ was able to accomplish in the 1960s. But not only did she lay the groundwork for it, she was at his side pushing him on and making sure that legislation was the appropriate legislation even years later when it did get to Congress to actually take some action. Always big advocate for women's rights. She fought both in the US and abroad for women. Her uncle Teddy had been president when women got the right to vote, and he was a big advocate of the suffrage, so she came by that honestly. She had worked with the League of Women Voters and made a lot of connection with other women activists. Even back when she came back to New York as a 20-year-old, she was getting involved with these women that were trying to enhance women's rights. and took on a number of meaningful issues in that regard. She was a powerful advocate for equal pay for women, equal political representation, and she was very conscious of international women's rights and the oppression of women in other countries. More than any other First Lady or since, she used her voice to shape public opinion and public policy in the United States. And she did it primarily through this very clever device of this column that she writes every day. And this column that is personal, and it's it's a little fun and a little gossipy, but it also gets to the point, and it makes people think about important issues of the time. Now, she does that for the 12 years that she's First Lady. But then in 1945, her husband dies, and she's 61 years old at that point. And she's this introvert. She would love nothing better in a certain way than to just get out of the public spotlight and be able to go back to her reading and her music and her few intimate friends. But she realized that she was a major force. She was a big influence. And maybe she needed to take the responsibility of continuing that. So in the first few months, she takes care of all the financial affairs of her husband. She gets rid of the big house. She didn't want a big house. She realized, I don't have to have this fantastic wardrobe anymore. She basically pulls off Valkill, her tiny little cottage that she'd built on that Hyde Park estate, and pulls it loose from the big house, gives the big house to the government to be the Roosevelt Library, Presidential Library, but then keeps her tiny little house on the side. She tones down her lifestyle significantly. She has a very modest lifestyle, and she runs it on her earnings from her writing and from her lectures. So she's becomes a kind of independent person, not really affected by the wealth she was born into. But now she recreates a life around the ideas and the social causes that she's been promoting. After only a week of hiatus, when her husband died, she went back to writing her My Life column, and she did it 6 days a week until the end of her life. President Truman, who took over from her husband, was very open to hearing from her. And she sent him little missives all the time. And he responded. And he needed to respond because this was an incredibly influential person. And he realized that if I'm going to get this democratic agenda through, the agenda that her husband began, I'm going to have her help because she was incredibly influential. And he always responded very promptly to any kind of message from Mrs. Roosevelt. And then after really just a few months, he began to think of how can I use Eleanor in a more effective way. And he makes her a delegate to the first organizational meeting of the United Nations General Assembly. And that took place in London in December of 1945, just a few months after her husband's death. And, this is a very, very important appointment. He could have had a diplomat do this, but he felt like Mrs. Roosevelt would have the very most influence in that. And she took it very seriously. She knew that this was a high priority for her husband, the establishment of the United Nations. This body was going to really organize itself and say, what is the United Nations? How should it operate? And she felt a big sense of responsibility to participate in that. So she accepted that appointment, but with fear and trembling. Of course, it was a stellar lineup of people from all over the world who were meeting together to form the United Nations. Her appointment made front page news in the newspapers across the country. And then when she was confirmed in the Senate, only one person voted against her. And that also made front page news. How could anyone vote against Mrs. Roosevelt? So for the 7 years that she was involved with the United Nations, her primary interest was human rights. And I think it's hard for us to look back at that organization and understand the kind of impact she had, because there was nothing in the charter that would necessarily have said human rights was a big, or nothing in the mandate to form the United Nations. There was nothing there that necessarily would have said human rights would be a big priority. But for the whole history of the United Nations, that's been a huge priority. And that was really her advocacy from the very beginning. The UN Economic and Social Council asked her to serve on a new committee that would plan for a permanent creation of a Commission of Human Rights, something that would be a part of the United Nations and would be there always to look at human rights in countries across the world. There were 18 delegates that were appointed to that commission. Then the commission selected its own chair, and they chose Mrs. Roosevelt as the chair. This is the kind of high regard that she was held in worldwide, because these would have been representatives of countries across the world. So her task would, as the chair of that commission, would be to guide them to say, okay, what are human rights? And to create a universal declaration of human rights for the United Nations. And for the next 2.5 years, that's what she did. Between May of 1946 and December of 1948, she worked as chair of that commission, and it was a very big job to get all the countries in the world to decide what are universal standards of human rights, that if you're going to be a member of the United Nations, you're going to be held to those standards. She said, quote, "I used to think I had reached my limits of my patience bringing up 5 children. But," she said, "I was mistaken. It took much more patience to preside over the Commission for Human Rights." This was, and especially, you can imagine, this woman who is an introvert. It was a very, very big task to take on that. Now, we're not going to go through all of the aspects of human rights they dealt with, but they basically just looked at what does it mean to give humane treatment to citizens all over the world. And today, when a country is required to take a political refugee from another country where they're being oppressed, that is a part of the human rights agreement that country has with the United Nations. So that actually shapes immigration policy all over the world. And many, many individual countries, there are, they can be tried in the United Nations for violations of human rights. And so they have an obligation to treat their citizens in a certain way. Now, this is just mind-blowing to me to think of where Eleanor Roosevelt started as this shy kid, and how she maintained being an introvert all of her life. She still loved being alone. She loved going to Valkill, reading a book, listening to music, maybe having a few close friends over. This was really who she was. And she didn't let go of that introverted person. But she also rewired her brain, starting with that kind of discipline that her grandmother required of her, that yes, you're going to come out at that party and you're going to stand up straight and you're going to speak forcefully, not in a tiny little wimpy voice, and you're going to be authoritative. You're going to be forceful. So she learned how to have that kind of behavior as a child. Then she found the causes she cared about, and she could exhibit those extroverted behaviors in order to accomplish the goals she wanted to accomplish. Now, an amazing combination of introversion and extroversion. All those fantastic traits of introverts, depth of thinking, tenacity, stick-to-itiveness, never give up, all that was there. She even used her introverted qualities of, she loved to write, she loved to sit alone and think about things. So she made her voice heard in the newspaper instead of necessarily, vocally in front of large audiences. That's how she got to be a spokesperson. She understood the value of her introversion and what she had to contribute as a creative problem solver that way. And then she took on those traits of an extrovert by the neuroplasticity of her brain to do other things as well. So in the check-in, we'll have a little more discussion about this. See you.